economy, Prime Minister. Time for another U-turn.
Demands for Liz Truss to reverse more of last month's budget are growing today as market pressure continued to raise the cost of government borrowing.
His cabinet colleague.
When Liz Truss came in for only her second Prime Minister's question time, most of the noise came from the Labour benches.
During her leadership contest, the Prime Minister said, and I quote her exactly, "I'm very clear. I'm not planning public spending reductions." Is she going to stick to that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What we will make sure is that over the medium term, the debt is falling. But we will do that not by cutting public spending, but by making sure we spend public money well.
Later attempts to clarify those words suggested Liz Truss and her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, might restrain overall spending, but might not technically cut it in real terms, depending on your inflation measure. In truth, the level of pressure from the city and from Tory MPs means it's far from certain what the government will announce in its next economic policy statement. After the Prime Minister had left the chamber, one senior Tory said the Chancellor would have to reverse a lot more of last month's tax cuts.
There are many, myself included, who believe that it is quite possible that he will simply have to come forward with a further rowing back on the tax announcements that he made on the 23rd of September. So could I ask my right honourable friend to confirm that that possibility is still on the table?
There are not any plans to reverse any of the tax measures announced in the growth plan.
The pressure on the government was added to by words from the Governor of the Bank of England yesterday. On a visit to Washington, he told just about anyone he bumped into that the bank's latest intervention, buying government debt to prevent fire sales by pension funds, would end on Friday.
You're committed to wrapping up the programs by the end of the week?
Yes.
Any comment? Sorry. And what about the request from the Pensions and Lifetime Savings Association that it run to the end of the month, if not longer?
I think they need to concentrate on doing everything they need to do to be done by the end of this week.
Is there anything that you would see that would make you change your mind on the thinking?
No, you need to concentrate on being done by the end of this week.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Well, we hope they'll be listening to us. I mean, basically, we want the same things as they want. We're just interested in having market stability. And we feel that because the origin of the market instability was the mini-budget a few weeks ago, it would make more sense to keep the gilt purchasing facility open until the next fiscal statement at the end of October.
That spat didn't help calm the market for government debt. Tomorrow, Kwasi Kwarteng will speak at the IMF gathering in Washington. Back in Westminster, voices growing for him to fill in some of the £62 billion black hole identified yesterday by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, either with spending cuts or tax rises.
I think if we saw anything on October 31st, on Halloween, when the Chancellor presents his medium-term fiscal strategy that has debt to GDP rising next year, the year after, and the year after, and then in year 5 dropping by 1/10 or 2/10 of GDP, I just don't think the market will see that as credible. There will need to be a down payment, effectively.
Okay. And that's spending cuts, basically?
Absolutely, or tax rises, some kind of fiscal consolidation.
That's unlikely.
Given where we are in a very serious situation, I don't think there is a plausible, credible package that's going to work on the 31st now that doesn't involve U-turning on more of these, because markets are going to need to see that the government is saying, I've changed course. So the most likely that I'd have thought that we'll see a further U-turn is on the corporation tax position.
Liz Truss heard some of the internal criticism for herself tonight at a meeting of backbench Tory MPs. Even supporters of hers said they were surprised how cool the reception was for a leader barely 1 month in the job. And there's more words filtering out from that meeting with backbenchers that Liz Truss has had this evening. I'm told the mood was despairing, and one person said worse than the dog days of Theresa May, when, of course, the party was eating itself alive. As the Prime Minister came into question time, another interesting moment, that silence on the Tory benches, hardly anyone cheering, and very interestingly, quite a few ministers peppered around on the back benches. it looks like there had been a whips operation just beforehand to make sure the chamber wasn't too empty on the Prime Minister's side. A classic way of showing your of the unpopularity of a Prime Minister by simply not turning up for the big event like that. How Liz Truss can turn it around with a fiscal event on the 31st of October that is looking more and more like it's going to be packed with something that looks a lot like a spending cut, even if though she doesn't want to talk about it as a spending cut, and which will look like U-turns on the tax cuts that were given only last month. Very hard to see how that's going to turn around the mood. And I have to say, the mood amongst Tory MPs, which when Liz Truss first came in, those who didn't support her, you could say were a bit disengaged, maybe polishing up their CVs, getting ready for life outside Parliament. It has darkened, hardened in the last few days, I have to say. And there are people around there plotting in a way that you normally expect towards the end of someone's premiership.
Gary Gibbon in Westminster. Now, the cost of government borrowing has continued to soar after the Bank of England insisted that it will stop its emergency bond buying programme this Friday, despite some earlier reports that it might be extended. The bank implemented the measures to protect pension funds from insolvency when the mini-budget was followed by a massive sell-off of government bonds. Our economics reporter, Neil MacDonald, is here. So can you first settle its arguments about how we got into this mess?
Well, let's go back to where it all began by looking at the change in interest rates on long-term government borrowing. So if you look here, the lines along the bottom are for the USA and the Euro area governments, and then the red line is the UK government, and you can see how it spikes up after the 23rd of September, the date of what was meant to be a mini-budget. The reason for that jump, that was the day when we learned that the government wanted to borrow a huge amount of money from the financial markets, and we had very little detail about either how much money or how it would ever be repaid. The result of that was turmoil, and that change you see in interest rates over 3 days, you wouldn't normally see that in the course of an entire year in that financial market.
Right, so why did that matter to pension funds?
Well, pension funds are big investors in these markets. They hold a lot of this government debt, and they buy and sell it all the time to each other and to other big investors. Now, there's a big new supply of government debt about to come into this market. And in free markets, if there's a big increase in supply, then that tends to mean a fall in price. So the pension funds find themselves holding assets which are falling in value.
So why did the Bank of England have to get involved?
Well, the pension funds bought some of this government debt using money that they borrowed from banks. And as the government debt started to fall in value, the banks said, we'd like you to provide us with a bit of cash that we can set against all the money you've borrowed from us. Some of the pension funds decided to try and raise that cash by selling yet more of the government debt they held. And of course, as they started to sell it, the price starts falling even more. And you can see emerging pretty quickly a cycle of more sales, falling prices. The bank steps in and said, we will buy the bonds, we will buy the government debt from you, we will provide you with the cash you need, and we will break that downward spiral.
So that explains everything up to today. Why the turmoil today?
Yeah, because basically throughout this, the bank has said, this support is here until this Friday, no extensions. I think the thought was, that will give these pension funds time to sort themselves out, either take the money from the Bank of England or raise it from another source if they can. And in fact, so far, the Bank of England has not bought many of these government bonds, government debt from these pension funds. And there's a suspicion that the funds needed a bit of a kick to start sorting things out. But, and of course there is always a but with these things, there is a possibility that the bank has now put itself on a bit of a collision course with the financial markets. These pension funds still need to raise tens of billions of pounds. What happens if they can't do that in the next few days? Does that downward spiral we were just talking about kick back in? And if it does the Bank of England then have to perform a massive U-turn, step back in and stabilise these markets all over again?
Neil MacDonald, thank you. Well, earlier I spoke to the Business Minister, Lord Callanan, and I began by asking him to clarify, after some mixed messages from the government today, whether there would be spending cuts or not.
Well, the Chancellor is going to set out the plan in his medium-term fiscal statement at the end of the month, and that would be the detail of how the government will get spending under control, how we will get debt under control, how we will bring debt down in the medium term as part of the fiscal plan. And that's
but
what
the Prime Minister was right when she said that there are no plans to cut public spending, was she?
The Prime Minister is always right. The Prime Minister in charge of the government. If that's what the Prime Minister said, then that's what will happen.
Right. I mean, the trouble is that people just don't know what to believe at the moment because things keep changing. You know, there are U-turns.
There was one U-turn, call it what you want, on the 45p rate of tax, which was proving as a distraction. But beyond that, I think the government have been very consistent.
Right. I mean, the trouble is the markets seem to have already made up their minds, haven't they, on what they are prepared to accept. And they are not happy still with the budget as it is.
Well, I think we need to provide the reassurance to the market. We need to set out the details of our growth plans. That's the important part of the government's strategy.
So at the moment, do you think the markets are just wrong in their reaction?
The markets are never wrong.
They're
Clearly,
never wrong.
they are,
right.
The markets
so
are,
not convinced.
interpreting the signs as they see them, and it's up to us as a government to convince them that our plan is right and that pursuing a policy of economic growth is the right one for the country.
So how concerned should we be about our defined benefit pension funds at the moment?
I mean, clearly it's a time of great turbulence in the markets, and sadly interest rates are going up as they are in the rest of the world, but the Bank of England has already intervened to protect pension funds, and I think people's pensions are safe.
Well, I mean, it's not clear that people's pension funds are safe. I mean, is the government working on a bailout for pension funds? Should there be a failure?
I have no knowledge if the Chancellor is in discussions with the Bank of England or with the pension funds on that.
I mean, don't you think these things ought to be a bit clearer? I mean, we were told that this wasn't discussed at Cabinet yesterday, as well. And, it's alarming that there's a lot of turbulence in the markets now and nobody seems to know what's going on.
There is a lot of turbulence in the market. There's turbulence in market across the world. There's turbulence in the energy market, which is what I thought we were about to discuss today. But the Bank of England is responsible for monetary policy. The Chancellor is responsible for fiscal policy. I'll allow them to have their discussions.
Well, let's talk about the energy market because that is in effect a U-turn, because while Liz Truss said she was against windfall taxes, what you're doing now with these renewable and nuclear operators is basically limiting the amount of money they can make. It's effectively doing the same thing as a windfall tax. So just be honest about it.
I would be honest.
It'll be popular. You could just say that's what we're doing.
But it's not a windfall tax. This is a specific targeted intervention at those few companies that are benefiting from earlier contracts. So they're making excessive amounts of money at the moment. So we're capping their wholesale costs, and that will feed directly, not to the exchequer, not to the revenue of the government, but will feed directly into the market, and therefore that will benefit consumers in terms of a lower overall cost. So it's not the same as a windfall tax.
I mean, there's a credibility gap at the moment, isn't there, in pretty much everything the government announces. Do you recognise that?
No, I don't recognise that.
But I mean, all the experts are saying the only thing that is going to calm the markets down is a full-scale reversal of the tax cuts, the unfunded tax cuts in the budget. And that again has been ruled out today. So where are we going with this?
Well,
it's more chaos, isn't it?
The Prime Minister has set out her view. The Chancellor agrees completely with the Prime Minister. He will set out in his medium-term financial plan at the end of the month, accompanied by the OBR forecasts of exactly how the government plans to get debt down in the medium term. And that's what markets will be waiting for, the reassurance. At the same time, of course, let's put it in context, we also have a growth plan, and the solution to many of our difficulties will be to up the trend rate of growth in the British economy. And if we can do that, then, of course, the government will have more revenue to spend.
Lord Callanan, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So when it comes to energy, the thing we were just discussing there, the government appears to have delivered another U-turn, this time on what seems to many to look like a windfall tax on renewable energy companies. Revenues from nuclear power plants and solar and wind farms could be capped under this new government plan. But the ministers insist that this does not count as a windfall tax, as you just heard. Let's go to our reporter, Simon Roach. Simon.
Hi, well, yeah, you're totally right. As we've just heard, there's been a huge amount of back and forth today on this question of whether this is or is not a windfall tax. And the truth is, it's not really clear yet because, yes, the government has made another major intervention on energy and has given very few details. Let's look at what we do know. The government says that from next year, it's going to introduce a cap on the revenues that renewable and nuclear energy companies can make. Why? Well, currently, the price of electricity is set by the price of gas. So in theory, that means when the gas price shot up this year, there are some renewable energy generators whose cost for things like wind and solar has not changed, can suddenly start selling their electricity at these very high gas prices and are now making a lot of money. The government says this isn't fair, it wants to change the system, which is why it's going to cap their revenues. But the fact that it's not given much detail on exactly how it's going to do this has created this huge uncertainty. Now, experts I spoke to today said that this may actually be a kind of negotiating tactic from the government, because what it really wants to do is to push some of these older, potentially very lucrative renewable projects onto a different type of contract altogether, a fixed price contract. And the companies running them so far just haven't been wanting to do it.
And what's the likely implications of all this?
Well, again, it really depends on the details, which we don't know yet. If the government do end up generating a revenue from this new policy, then it's going to be very hard to keep arguing that it's not a tax. Labour will seemingly be right, and this will look like yet another U-turn. But the thing that's really concerned experts today is just the signal all this sends to the investment community. There's already a pre-existing windfall tax on oil and gas companies, but the government's own rules says that they can largely avoid that tax by reinvesting in the UK. And so far, this week's announcement for renewable projects doesn't suggest there's going to be an equivalent renewable incentive for renewable projects. Now, separately today, the new Climate Minister, Graham Stewart, told MPs that exploring for new oil and gas is in fact good for the environment. So overall, this is all kind of coming together to really dismay a lot of experts and green groups who say that, look, just 1 year on from the climate conference COP26 here in Glasgow, this new government is actually still prioritising fossil fuels, not the renewable energy that can potentially help people's bills and the climate.
Simon Roach in Glasgow. Well, joining me now from New York is Gillian Tett, editor-at-large of the Financial Times in the United States. Let's come back to the bigger picture of what the Prime Minister has been saying today, where she said no spending reductions and the tax cuts stay in place. Will the markets tolerate that? What do they want?
Well, I think you have to start off by realising that from the perspective of global markets in a place like New York, essentially the UK has become like Italy in terms of the sense of financial risk, political instability, the policy-making uncertainty, all of which we've seen in Italy before, is now being seen in the UK, but sadly without the good food and sunshine and glamour of Italy. So there is tremendous amount of concern right now amongst international investors. Many of them, as you've just heard, are essentially saying that unless there's another U-turn on fiscal policy, it's going to be very hard to have much faith in the UK finances. And on top of all that, you've got this very, very nasty squeeze in the government bond markets, the lack of liquidity, and the fact that this is creating enormous problems for pension funds. So all in all, the message from international investors is, one, we're really concerned about what the UK is doing. We used to think it was stable and solid and boring. Now it's quasi-Italian. And secondly, that the type of problems we're seeing in the UK could easily spread outside the UK shores and affect other markets, and it could potentially herald a much nastier, wider financial shock.
Right, and is that sort of lack of confidence going to cascade now, or are people prepared to wait until the end of the month when the Chancellor delivers his next financial statement?
Well, people are very keen to see what the Chancellor is going to do, and in particular, whether he can deliver a budget that looks as if the sums are actually going to add up. And the Chancellor's actually in Washington for the rest of the week. He'll be talking to the other G7 policy leaders and central bankers. He'll be getting some pretty stern words from the International Monetary Fund and others. And he's going to have to basically have a dress rehearsal for whether he can actually convince anybody by what he's actually doing. But the thing that has really terrified many investors has been this comment that essentially the pension funds have 3 days to get this sorted out or else. Because what that means is that all around the world right now, at large financial institutions, you have the risk managers and traders braced, thinking, OK, if we get to the end of this 3-day deadline and the British pension funds haven't managed to sort themselves out, Essentially, they're going to have to start selling more things. They'll be dumping stuff in fire sales. There can be some pretty funky, weird moves of the sort we've seen before in financial crises. And what we've learned in 2007 and 8, or what we learned in 1998, is that financial markets are prone to contagion. And what starts in one corner can end up infecting other corners because the investors who hold different assets in different markets are connected, and they can end up making fire sales that affect other asset prices. So there's a lot of concern. And frankly, going into the end of the week, this 3-day deadline, many people I'm speaking to are essentially saying the clock is ticking.
So you think the Bank of England's going to have to U-turn?
I'm very wary of predicting anything right now, because right now, 3 hours is pretty hard to predict, never mind 3 days. I think that the Bank of England has been very, very clear that it says it will not U-turn. It says that, it knows perfectly well that if it does that, it will essentially be undermining a lot of the monetary policy stance it's trying to take. There are dissenting voices inside the Bank of England. There are dissenting voices, obviously, across the rest of the British government. But I think right now, all bets are off.
OK. And just finally, just because there's been an argument between the government and various experts about who and what is really to blame for the turmoil, Jacob Rees-Mogg's been out this morning saying, well, it's mostly to do with interest rates. And everybody else, it seems to be saying, well, actually, it's quite a lot to do with the government's mini budget. Can you just give us your verdict on that?
Well, to use non-technical term, that's pretty much bollocks. I think that for the most part, it really was the budget and the way it was delivered and the message inside it, which sparked the beginning of the crisis. The Bank of England certainly is to blame for not having prepared for these kind of dislocations. The British pension funds have appeared to have been somewhat asleep at the wheel in terms of their risk management systems. But at the end of the day, the spark that lit this fire was very much the budget announcement.
Gillian Tett, thank you very much indeed. And I'm not sure if we're allowed to say that, so I'm sorry if you were offended.